Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Center for International Governance Innovation, or CIGI, as we say. My name is Fred Kuntz. I'm the Vice President of Public Affairs at CIGI. Tonight's Environment and Energy panel discussion is co-sponsored by CIGI and Alternatives Journal as part of the magazine's 40th anniversary. And I encourage you to pick up a copy of Alternatives. Their anniversary edition is on sale tonight for a special price of just $5 here. You can't get it for that at the stores. Have a look on your way out. Besides the audience here tonight, we also have a global audience watching on the live webcast. Following tonight's address, we welcome questions from the audience, either at the microphones here at CIGI, up on the stairs on the aisles, or if you're watching online, you can ask questions through the live chat function on your screen, and we'll transmit those questions to the panel. I'd like to thank CIGI's public event sponsors, 570 News and Wordsworth Books. Thank you for your ongoing support. I'd also like to acknowledge a couple of special guests who are joining us this evening, Kathy McClellan, the Natural Resources and Energy Critic for the Green Party of Canada, and Michael Harris, Kitchener-Conestoga's Member of Provincial Parliament and also the Environment Critic for his party. Our topic tonight is Deep Roots, New Shoots, the environment yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Our planet, as you know, is facing significant challenges as a result of human development and consumption. We've heard dire warnings from experts around the world about the risks of climate change, global warming, and other forms of devastating environmental destruction. Yet we continue to witness a lack of progress and international consensus to protect the environment. In addition to these vulnerabilities, we're on the eve of a major international climate change conference in Durban, South Africa, part of the ongoing annual environmental process that really began in Rio and went through Kyoto and Copenhagen, and we all know how well that's going. So these are the reasons why tonight's discussion is so timely and important. I won't be introducing all of tonight's panelists. I will be introducing Nicola Ross, who is our moderator, and she'll be introducing the panelists. Raised in southern Ontario's Niagara Escarpment, Nicola developed a keen sense of place at an early age. She studied biology at the University of Guelph, but soon discovered that a pen was her tool of choice in the environmental battles that appeared as she lived and worked in different parts of Canada and the world. An award-winning author of 4 books, Nicola has published articles in The Walrus, The Globe and Mail, Ontario Nature, Alternatives Journal, in the Hills magazine, Harold Smith Country Life, and more. Now she's the editor-in-chief of Alternatives Journal, Canada's national environmental magazine, and Nicola pursues her love of writing and the environment on a full-time basis. Complementing her writing prowess is Nicola's growing list of interviews. With her environmental focus, she's had the pleasure of personally interviewing Margaret Atwood, Bruce Cockburn, Wade Davis, and many others, often before a live audience as tonight. So please welcome Nicola Ross.
And shall I take it away? Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our panel discussion tonight. Before I introduce our panelists, I'll give you a few, just give you an idea of how the evening is set up. The way it's going to work is starting with Colin Issacs, excuse me. He is going to give a short presentation on some of his thoughts on tonight's topic, Deep Roots, New Shoots, excuse me. He will be followed by Bob Paehlke, who will come next and give a short presentation. Following that, we're going to have a discussion among the panelists on their ideas. After that short discussion, we're going to hear from Kraft Sloan, followed by Bob, our second Bob Gibson. That will be followed by a short discussion on their topic, and then a more broad discussion among the panelists. As that discussion gets going, we will open it up for a question and answer from people of the audience, and we encourage you to write down questions, and please use the microphones. I see there are 6 microphones set up along the way. We ask that you do use the microphones, and I believe there's some ushers that can show you how to work them, and we also ask you to identify yourself when you're asking questions, but that'll be a little bit later. Before I get going, I just want to say most of the people, I think, watched the CBC documentary. We called the evening's panel discussion Deep Roots, but I think it could be what they said in the video presentation, and that is, will we do it? Can we do it? And that is survive the future. And I think that's a good theme for how our discussion is going to go. If all goes well, I won't ask any questions of our panelists, and they will get the conversation going themselves, but I have some questions as well, and I'm always keen to ask them. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panelists, and we'll get going. The idea is that we'll be out of here sometime between 8:30 and 9 o'clock this evening. So, Colin Issacs. If you wonder why we asked Colin here this evening, consider this. Colin is a chartered chemist, a consultant, journalist, municipal councillor, well, he has been some of these things, a municipal councillor, member of the Ontario Legislature, climate change specialist, executive director of Pollution Probe, chair of the Canadian Environment Industry Association, and this is especially important to me, he was part of a panel that awarded Caledon, the municipality where I live, the award of being the greenest town in Caledon, or in Ontario, and I've always been proud of that. Thank you, Colin. While concern for the environment is the central theme to all of these jobs, the result of this long, illustrious, and fabulously varied career is that Colin has a unique ability to look back at the environmental movement and comment on where it needs to go. He also has his own Wikipedia page, which in this electronic era is noteworthy. Next after Colin is Bob Paehlke, and I'm quoting Bob. Bob once said, "Environmentalism has the potential to become the first original ideological perspective to develop since the middle of the 19th century." This belief pervades Bob's academic and writing career, giving him, and it, his career that is, an upbeat, positive note. The author of, or editor of 5 books, most of which deal in some way with the environment and politics, Bob was also a co-founding editor of Alternatives Journal. 40 years ago, in the early 1970s, as environmental concerns came to the fore, and using scissors and electroset, Bob wanted to bridge the gap between what was happening on university campuses and in the budding new environmental organizations. Alternatives was the answer. He is now a professor emeritus from Trent University, where he taught environmental politics and policy in the Environmental and Resources Studies program. So welcome to Waterloo, Bob.
Thank you.
He had a long drive. Next is Kraft Sloan. A member of Parliament in Ottawa for 10 years, Karen put her environmental training to good use. With a master's degree in environmental studies from York University, she became involved in a number of environmental issues, including toxics, children's health, and northern issues. When I first met her years ago, she was the first one that told me about POPs, or priority organic pollutants. I'm envious of a position she held for 2 years as Canada's ambassador for the environment. In this role, she traveled extensively representing Canada at international meetings and other events of an environmental nature. Although Karen doesn't live here anymore, I see from her Wikipedia page that she was actually born in Kitchener.
Yes, that's right.
So presumably she is feeling at home here in Waterloo. And finally, Bob Gibson. I admit to not finding a Wikipedia page for Bob. However, I did find one for Robert Lee Hoot Gibson, a U.S. Army captain. Robert Gibson, who is a professional wrestler and half a tag team named Rock and Roll Express.
That's him.
And a Canadian rower, but he was born in 1986. So I presume, Bob, no Wikipedia page or not yet. Despite this shortcoming, Bob looks every bit the university professor, and so he should. He has been a professor in the Department of Environment and Resource Studies at the University of Waterloo for coming on 30 years. And it is with a similar level of commitment that he took over editing Alternatives Journal from Bob Paehlke in the mid-1980s. As Bob built up his reputation as one of the country's foremost experts on environmental policy issues, broader sustainability imperatives, and regulated governance matters, he eventually had to turn over the editing reins of the magazine. But that doesn't mean that Bob abandoned the publication, far from it. Bob continues to head up our editorial board and is intimately involved in every issue, often ensuring that editors, like me, and like the rest of the staff, most of our staff is here tonight, do not get into too much trouble. So thanks, Bob, for that. At any rate, I will get going, and I guess the other thing that we all share in common up here is we were all around in 1971 when alternatives got going 40 years ago, and that's really the time frame of the discussion starting tonight, 40 years to the past and 40 years to the future. So with that, Colin, take it away.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Nicola. It's a great pleasure for me to be here this evening, and thank you for the invitation. In regard to your comment about Caledon winning Greenest Community in Ontario Award, that was an initiative of TV Ontario's Studio 2 program.
Yes.
I thought it was a great initiative and something they should have continued, but unfortunately, like so many other things, that contest is no longer with us.
And I don't know that Colin would still qualify either. So.
Well, that's also one of the things, not whether or not Caledon qualifies, but how things have changed that I think we're going to talk about this evening. Before I make a few key points, I just thought I'd introduce a couple of caveats. First of all, whatever else I say this evening, and sometimes I may end up contradicting myself, I do want to stress that we've made great progress on environmental issues in the last 40 years. I think it's important to recognize that things have changed dramatically. Back in 1971, communities did not have recycling programs or composting programs. There was no control of ozone-depleting substances that subsequently we learned were making a big hole in the ozone layer, allowing ultraviolet light to get through and to potentially cause skin cancers and other problems. Acid rain, or at least the gases that cause acid rain, were being spewed from stacks right across the continent, the largest of which was the super stack at Inco in Sudbury. And since then, we've been able to control that problem to a very significant extent. And we hadn't even thought about climate change because nobody had. It was hardly on the radar except for a couple of scientists who were beginning to recognize that maybe something could be going wrong with the atmosphere. Those are just a few examples of things that have come a long way in the last 40 years, and I think it's important to recognize that change for the better is indeed possible. Too often we hear that people won't change, that society can't change, and so on, but change has happened, it's still happening, and we are making the environment better than it was. Unfortunately, in my opinion, not just good enough to become as sustainable as we need to be. The other point that I want to make as sort of an opening caveat is that we'll probably be talking quite a bit this evening about environmental groups and non-governmental organizations. And when I use that term, I'm talking mainly about the larger groups that focus on national and provincial policy, groups like Pollution Probe and Greenpeace and the Suzuki Foundation and many others. I know that in addition to those national and regional groups, there are many hundreds, if not thousands, of community environmental groups. Many of you in the audience this evening may be members of those kinds of groups, and they focus on local issues, interactions with local councils, and by and large, those groups are doing a great job on the issues that they address, which of course gives you a hint of where I'm coming from with respect to some of the larger groups. The possibility exists that past executive directors of environmental groups like Pollution Probe always have a somewhat jaded opinion. When I was there, things were going just great. We were solving problems. We were interacting wonderfully with governments and making a real difference. And now it's not nearly as good as it was back then. maybe someone should do a survey of past executive directors of environmental groups to see if indeed we are a club of like-minded people. But certainly that's, again, an indication of my thoughts about the environmental movement these days. For 40 years, we've made great progress, but not nearly enough progress. More of the same is, in my opinion, not going to get us to a sustainable world, a sustainable human population. And by the way, I want to add, again, up front, the movie talked about the future of the Earth and the crisis facing the Earth. There is no crisis facing the Earth. The crisis is facing the human population. The Earth will be here even if human beings disappear. So let's be realistic and recognize that it's built into our DNA, into our thought processes, that we want to sustain the human population. We want there to be future generations. And in my opinion, that's what environmentalism is really all about. Of course, we can't sustain the human population unless the ecosystems of the world are healthy as well. So there is a very strong interaction in that regard. A world that was populated primarily by cockroaches and poison ivy really wouldn't be much good for us. But the world would still be here, the Earth would still be here, and barring something that I think is absolutely unimaginable, the Earth isn't going away. It's the human population and many other populations that are threatened. Having said that, let me get back to the point that more of what we have been doing for the last 40 years is, in my view, not going to be good enough to get us a sustainable human population. We've got to start looking at changing the way we address environmental issues. And I'm sure we're going to get into quite a lot of that later this evening. It used to be quite simple. You know, introduction of the blue box. I remember coming to address a Kitchener City Council meeting, must have been somewhere around 1984, when Kitchener was the only municipality in Ontario that had blue boxes. We at Pollution Probe were lobbying the provincial government to introduce them right across the province. And at the same time as we were doing that, Kitchener was thinking about getting rid of blue boxes and switching its garbage contract to a cheaper company that didn't bother with this recycling thing. The response from the population of Kitchener was tremendous. Kids came out from schools, environmental groups came out, and some of us came from other parts of the province, and we were successful in keeping the Blue Box program in Kitchener, and about 3 years later, we were successful in getting the province to encourage other municipalities to adopt Blue Box recycling. But you don't get a sustainable world just with recycling. So from simple things like Blue Box recycling across the province to really complicated issues like management of toxic substances and the even more complex climate change issue is really going to take a big change in the way we look at the problems, the way we interact with the environment, and the way we implement solutions.
Colin, can I just summarize what you're going to say and pass on to Bob?
Can I give you one quickie as well, just to wrap up? Since 2006, the last 5 years, I've been even more disappointed. I think that progress at the international and national level on environmental issues has been abysmal. And later on, I'll get into talking about some theories as to why that is.
Great. And so basically what I hear you saying is we've done a good job, but not a good enough job. Is that a fair assessment?
Yep.
And Bob P., that is, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Nikki. And thank you all for coming. When I was writing a piece for the 40th anniversary issue, which I gather is out there, it caused me to think back to the beginning of this thing. It was also pretty simultaneous with my 70th birthday. So all of these anniversaries were building up on me. So I thought about then, the origins of environmentalism in Canada and how what we were thinking then is different from now. And I've got 3 points that I'd like to make. The first one is quite striking to me. Back then, we had real doubts about, this is actually a quote from the article, the endless clutter of stuff industrial societies disgorged. We just sort of looked at it all and said, this isn't necessarily a good thing. We were as unsure that growth should continue, that is economic growth, as we were that it could continue. That's the sustainability question. Can it continue? We weren't so sure it should continue. Now, 40 years later, a green economy is seen as a way to continue or to return to economic viability within a limping, shaky economy with a financial crisis in much of Europe, sagging employment levels in North America, especially the US. We're seeing the environment greening the economy as a way to get the economy going, to make it stronger. Quite, in a way, the opposite of where we were at then.
Bob, that was that visual in the movie with the hybrid
Yes.
car and the deer and.
Yeah,
Yes,
it's a transformation. It's quite the transformation, sort of from skeptic regarding economic growth to best hope for achieving it. And that's in 40 years. That was pretty quick. Anyway, the second point I would make about that is that that desire to green the economy in the future and now makes sense in a lot of ways. It's not, a rejection so much as a change in thinking about how you resolve environmental problems. Energy efficiency is the cheapest source of new energy, and it's far more labor and jobs intensive than any other possible source of new energy. Solar and wind will be cheaper than oil soon. Solar's just about there now. And they're far more jobs intensive than than fossil fuel extraction and use. High-tech communications, the one bright spot, it built this auditorium, that key growth area gets you more dollars in the economy per unit of energy or per amount of material than what it replaces. And less energy and material throughputs, to use a jargony term, gives you lower environmental impacts. The less you process, the better. It's not the size of the economy in dollars that's the problem, it's how much stuff we're moving through it, especially extracting it from nature in the first place. So just think about, a website versus a newspaper, producing newspapers, or iPods versus CDs and stereos, or email versus snail mail. All of those shifts are doing the same thing, probably doing it better, and doing it with less energy and less materials and less environmental impact. Not that there's no environmental impact, but it's less than it would have been. Transit versus automobiles, more jobs, less energy per trip. Local and organic food, less energy, less pollution, more nutrition, more labor. It's a different kind of economy, but it's certainly less environmental damage involved in it. So that's why I think the thinking has shifted. And then the third and last point I would make, I'm doing pretty well for a professor.
It was Colin that said he wanted 5.
Who only wanted 5. Anyway, the last point is it's obviously not quite so simple that now we can just grow merrily and be green at the same time. It's not as easy as the deer and the car driving through the forest. Our 1970s moral wariness about unlimited growth still has legs. I mean, it's still real. Some of our globalized economy is pretty darn vulnerable, moving people around the planet and moving really heavy goods, not little light, expensive goods. I don't think that's problematic, but moving heavy goods, tons of steel, or I gather now even we import cement from China. That makes no sense to me. You move it halfway around the planet when, half of Canada is cement, if you just grind it up. It's not sustainable. That part of our economy is not sustainable, and it still isn't sustainable. And certain businesses, particularly old energy sources, are not entirely not sustainable. We could survive a little bit of them, but not as much as where we're going to get to if you project into the future fossil fuel consumption continuously rising. It can't happen, at least not without enormous costs to the planet. So all this sort of, those caveats are still there and still real. So, but on the other hand, I think there is opportunities now that there weren't in 1970 for certain businesses and most environmental groups to see eye to eye on a lot of issues.
But you're not afraid of technology, is that?
No.
Is that what you're saying?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I'm not so keen on the fake meat from the film.
No.
That'll make a lot of vegetarians, I think.
Yeah. When I first read about that fake meat, I remember thinking, oh my, yes, exactly. Well, now we're going to turn into a bit of a discussion up here. So unless, do you have some burning questions, Bob or Karen, to ask of Colin and Bob on their presentations, or should I jump in? Or
I just know you have a burning question. I know better than to get in the way of that.
Well, I'll take one, and then I don't want to have to use any more. I didn't know what people were speaking about exactly tonight, so I'm quite impressed by how close I was with Colin. And Colin, you spent a lot of time talking about NGOs and the environmental movement, and that they've done a great job, but maybe they have to change in the future. And some people in the room, and most of the people up here, I think, will be familiar with a 2004 study or article, essay by Michael Schellenberger and Ted Nordhaus called "The Death of Environmentalism." And in this essay, they claim that the environmental movement is incapable of responding to the challenge because its leaders, and I quote, are mired in the successes of the 1970s. They go on to suggest that we need to junk the movement's institutional framework and start afresh. Do you want to comment on whether you think it's that drastic? Do the pollution probes and the David Suzuki Foundations have to be torn apart?
I don't think they have to be torn apart, but I think they've got to be supplemented by other kinds of organization and other kinds of initiative. Because especially in Canada, it's extremely difficult for an environmental group to be viable, especially in the absence of government financial support, and they're not getting that today the way they used to when another party was in power. I think as well, there are two jobs that an environmental group should be doing. One is identifying the problems and communicating those problems both to decision makers and to the public at large.
Something Greenpeace does very well.
That's right.
I have to say.
And the other, well, and I would like to think that the pollution probe has done a lot of that in the past as well. But the other is working to identify solutions to the problems. And although in some other jurisdictions, environmental groups are still doing a pretty good job of strategizing and planning and developing policies, we're not really seeing a whole lot of that coming out of environmental groups today in Canada. It's a resources problem, but it's also a leadership problem. And I think we need to bring together new organizations that can play a key role in society in both of those aspects. And if at the end of the day it means today's groups go and new ones replace them, so be it.
Karen, I wonder if you want to comment on that from government side. I mean, how does it look when you were in government? Was it a healthy NGO sector, or was it frustrating?
I think one of the biggest issues is that it's an access problem. When I was in Ottawa in 1993, 2004, and then as ambassador from 2005 into 2006, I worked on Canada's three cornerstone environmental statutes: the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, the Species at Risk Act, and the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. And the reason that we were able to accomplish as little as we did, as much as we did in the House, was because we had the assistance, the advice, the support of the environmental community, that I found that when we were most successful, it was when we worked together with external groups. And whether it was individuals from the environmental movement, or whether it was working from the academic community and working with the scientists. And they were the individuals who could bring attention to those issues, and they were the individuals who came forward with really good policy ideas. Members of Parliament don't have that kind of staffing and capacity. There was only 3 or 4 of us out of 306 members on the Hill that had a dedicated person in their office working on environmental issues. And you can't function with today's complicated environmental issues. We had 700 amendments to the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. And it was Elizabeth May and David Schindler and other people from all kinds of industry associations that came together and found common ground on endangered species legislation. And so for me as a member of Parliament, I could go to my other colleagues and say, the scientists, it's not just the environmentalists that are saying it, it's the scientists and the research community that's saying it. And by the way, the Mining Association of Canada is saying it, or whomever was involved. So that was a really important policy support for us, but we also had people helping us on a daily basis on the amendment of legislation and working with us. And it was almost like a golden age of the green movement in many respects. That access has been cut off. The access to funding and support has been cut off. The Canadian delegation, when they went abroad, would have environmental representatives from the environmental world. They'd have academics. They'd have people from industry involved in those delegations. So that access has been cut.
So Bob, maybe you want to jump in here and just, where does that take us now that we're not in quite the golden age?
No, I mean, certainly the
It
last,
was very golden, but
The emerald age, I was going to call it, rather than
the
golden
last
age.
5 years have not been encouraging. I
No.
mean, not just in Canada, but in other countries. I felt we were moving ahead fairly well, late 90s, mid-late 90s, but it's gone downhill since then. And I think that's what Schellenberger and Nordhaus were addressing, that environmentalists were kind of stuck in this earlier era, and they should be looking at working with labor, working with business, working with others to talk about, how, not this sort of hair shirt stuff and crunchy granola, but get on with saying, we have a better idea. We have ideas that are useful for running a better economy, as well as, improving the environment.
But I think there's some really good examples of national and environmental organizations and others that Colin is referring to that are setting up those linkages. Yep. But then sometimes you have to sit back and look a little bit suspect at that sort of thing too, because where's the line? Where's the line that you cross? Are you being co-opted or are you cooperating?
Is there a time for quite a different model now? It seems that there's like the rock and the hard place in this debate. On the one hand, there's increasing demands and expectations and pressures and looming issues. And on the other hand, we have increasing, still, I think, skepticism that governments can do stuff, even if they were inclined, well enough, that corporations have the appropriate motivation to be relied upon to do very much that is necessary very well. And the environmental movement and civil society organizations in general are, at best, heavily pressed to deal with what was on their list of files 10 years ago.
And have enough money to do it.
And have less money currently. And you look around, sorry, well, where's the fourth option? Are we after, alien invasion?
Yeah.
Is there magical solutions of some kind? Gandalf will appear on a horse in the...
It's zombies, I hear.
But even to the zombies. That suggests that the old governance model, where you expected government to deal with the gaps and the invidious activities of corporate market activity adequately, if pushed at least by civil society. That model has underpinned, since the 70s and before. Is it dead? And if so, are there any, what do you do about that?
Yeah, I'm not sure, as I responded earlier, that it's dead, but I think it's very sick. I mean, let's take one of the best examples in the country as a positive environment economy initiative. It's got to be the Ontario Green Energy Act. Mm-hmm. The Ontario Green Energy Act was very strongly supported by a lot of environmental NGOs who got so carried away with it that they told the Liberal government in this province that everybody was on side with it and there wouldn't be any problems and it was a marvelous tool for re-election. Well, look what happened. It brought the Liberal government within 2% of popular vote of being defeated, because the environmental groups, to a large extent, and I don't know whether I'm critical of them for this, but they forgot the strategy of public consultation, which was core to their activities. They forgot that there are opponents out there who, no matter what it is you're trying to do, will try and bring you down, and very nearly did. And we came within a hair's breadth, in my opinion, of getting a government that would have dismantled as much of the environmental protection as they possibly could have done, as well as the Green Energy Act. And we've developed a horrendous urban-rural divide in this province, which I don't think is good democracy for anybody.
Mm-hmm. But part of that problem was also that the Act was very badly implemented.
Right. Agreed.
And that suggests a limitation of capacity, maybe motivation in some quarters, internally within government.
I think it points to the complexity in society as well, and that you have to be so on your game, but not just on your game in your own area. You have to be so on your game in your ability to communicate and use social media and digital media and reach out to people. When I was in Ottawa, and when I referred to it as the golden age, there was this warm, fuzzy glow of a few of us who cared about these issues on the Hill and the people that we found companionship in the environmental movement. It wasn't a golden age in terms of what the government was actually doing, so I want to really step back and correct that. But what I always wondered, as I had parades of interest groups coming through, and the environmental movement is there in the public interest, but they are an interest group, I wondered where the public was. I dealt with my constituents at home, but I wondered where the voice of the public is. And I think if you're searching for a fourth model or a new way, the public themselves has to take responsibility, and there has to be a space created within that infrastructure that allows the public voice to come through, because that's where we're falling apart. And that's the problem with democracy. You're not going to have a healthy democracy. You're not going to make the shift to sustainability unless the public are involved.
Which leads me to an opinion which is probably too big to get into this evening, but that I think our democracy is broken.
I think so too.
Back in the 90s, the 80s, something like the Green Energy Act would not have abolished public consultation over the siting of wind turbines. I mean, the fact that anybody, let alone environmental groups, let alone a Liberal government, thought that they could just wipe away all of the consultative practice that have taken decades to build up in this province is in my mind, nothing short of outrageous.
I knew I should have got Colin before he brought up changing democracy as let's keep the thoughts of this discussion on that talking about democracy, but also where is the public, and I also wonder where is the sort of next generation of environmental groups. But we do have to move on to our next give Karen and Bob Gibson their chance. So Karen, take it away.
Well, I'll just don't count in my 7 minutes my setup here. Anyway, I'm really pleased to be here tonight. This is a fantastic facility, and it's a real testament to what you have committed to here in the community, both to CG and to Alternative Journal, for your dedication. I was born in this community, and I attended Waterloo University later after I moved away, and I don't recognize the place to the extent that I got so lost tonight. The principal reason that I ran for public office in the first place was to better understand how we make decisions, how decision-making occurs in Ottawa, because I wanted to be in a better position to advocate for environmental protection and sound sustainability policy. And it seemed to me as an outsider before I came to Ottawa that it was very opaque and very mysterious. And I have a few points of things, observations that I made, that I've made from my time there. I'm not going back 40 years, I'm only going back 20 years. And so when I was there for 13 years, I really made me wonder if politicians and political leaders have the capacity or the desire to deal with some of the big environmental problems of the day. And a lot of my like-minded colleagues and myself really felt that there was a lot of things that were left undone. And very often what happened was that the big decisions, the big challenges of the day were left for the next generation of legislators to deal with, whereas the big things that most people in Ottawa wanted to deal with were the things that helped them get reelected. And for many reasons, complex and difficult decisions with long-term and seemingly uncertain consequences, such as those within the environmental domain, rarely rank high on a government's list of things to do. And as you know, uncertainty increases political risk, and we know governments stay well clear of political risk-taking.
Except for Stéphane Dion.
Well, that's a whole other topic that we won't go into right now. But economic considerations usually took precedent over health or environmental concerns. Environmental protection was often seen as hostile to the economy. Powerful and private public institutions that influence politicians don't like uncertainty either, and they invest great energy to ensure that uncertainty is minimized and that their control is maximized. And I witnessed on the House Environment Committee lots of government lobbying and people professing the purity of their products and the infallibility of their processes. But we know that our past is littered by examples of industry pressuring government to weaken or avoid regulating the harm done by their products. Tobacco, lead, asbestos are monuments to these profound failures. Environment Canada was established 40 years ago, but it has really long, deep roots in the government through the Meteorological Service, which was established in 1871 and is celebrating its 140th birthday. And I saw, when I was sitting on the House Committee and when I was Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of the Environment, the mistrust that other government departments had for Environment Canada. And as a result of that mistrust, the longer that a piece of environmental legislation or other policy instruments stayed in the system, the weaker they tended to get as other government departments worked very aggressively. Their environment is a horizontal issue, and it cuts across a lot of other government departments. There were 38 revisions to the committee report, the government response to the committee report on the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. And the government departments weighed in vociferously on this. And twice, CEPA, it was introduced and then it fell for the 97.
CEPA being the Canadian
Environmental Protection Act. It failed on the order desk because of the election, and the House prorogued, so it failed again. And each time that legislation came back, it was even weaker. And we were in the House debating a new amendment that came forward after the bill had come back to the House on virtual elimination. And it was a weaker amendment that the government was putting forward than what they had even supported in committee. And that was due to an unparalleled lobby effort by industry, and in fact there was a multinational in Quebec that phoned the Prime Minister's office and threatened to remove their facilities. In addition, the government's tools for making good environmental policy are insufficient. With the cutbacks that we suffered in the 1990s and the corporatization of government, we lost a lot of science capacity, but more recently, I think all of you have heard about the cuts to Environment Canada scientists, as well as the muzzling of Environment Canada scientists. And so I have a few ideas about what we need to do or what we could do to improve things for the future. So my first one is the reflexive politician or policymaker and changing the culture of Parliament. So the first step in developing leadership for sustainability requires self-examination and the understanding that sustainability must act as a touchstone, not merely for professional but personal attitudes and actions. And we can change the culture of Parliament to be more sensitive to an environmental ethic if we elect different people. The second point is taking an integrated and coherent approach to the policy-making process across government. We need to avoid policy-making by drift, and what I mean by this is the usual state of affairs where small, discrete, negotiated decisions are made that result in a drift away from stated goals or original aims. Do you think, well, I'll just cave into this one? And so after a few years of caving in, you realize that you're very far away from protecting environment and human health. Or contradictory policy decisions made between or amongst departments and within departments themselves. And third, remembering that national environmental policy making resides within an international context that both shapes and is shaped by what we do in Canada. And this can provide a leverage to mobilize action for positive change. The fourth point is that the problem context is the problem. And many people fail to recognize that...
Say that again.
The problem context is the problem with an exclamation point. Many fail to recognize that ecological and social systems are linked, that they're complex, and outcomes can be uncertain. And we ignore this at our peril. The fifth point is that boundaries amongst the research sectors are blurring as traditional drivers for research change, thus giving rise to and as well requiring new institutional forms. And new institutional forms are required to reframe the old relationships and to bridge the divides created by the disciplines and by the separation of worlds of scholarship and policy. And this also includes a need to emphasize new tools to translate and communicate research to policy, and you saw some of that in the film. And then the final point is that equity as a part of a concept of sustainability is an important integrator, both as driving the integration and as its outcome. And to truly practice sustainability, we must identify and challenge the conditions of inequity that result in the disconnect amongst the three considerations inherent in sustainability, that is, ecological, economic, and equity.
Ooh.
This is my 7 minutes, okay?
You were bang on 7 minutes, and I think what Karen's talking about gives us an idea of how complex some of these things are, but we will have a chance to question her on that. But before we do, Dr. Gibson.
To bring it down a few notches. I can do that. Nikki asked me to talk about the past, the present, and the future in 7 minutes. So the past, let's go back to the mid-70s. Mid-70s, I had a job for a whole year with Environment Canada. And there was one file that was kind of representative of the era. A little weird, but representative. It involved the Montreal Olympics. And Her Majesty the Queen. Indeed, the file was informally referred to as what to do about the Queen's brown trout.
Okay.
So, during the Montreal Olympics, the Queen was one of the dignitaries who was doing official things, and she arrived on the Royal Yacht Britannia. some Quebec environmental and nationalist advocates found out that the Royal Yacht did not have a holding tank. And they asked Environment Canada to lay charges under the Ocean Dumping Act pointing to contamination of the St. Lawrence River. My superiors, perhaps not surprisingly, were not inclined to do so. And the reasons for that are probably fairly obvious too. They didn't want to provide advantage to Quebec nationalist interests as opposed to federalist ones. They didn't want to offend the Queen. They didn't want to offend the Olympics. They didn't want to, perhaps most importantly, raise an issue that would inevitably bring attention to the fact that Montreal itself did not have sewage treatment. Indeed, any contributions from Her Majesty would be surrounded by a very large school of less aristocratic products. So this was, in its basic character, typical of what was going on in those times. The focus was on mitigation of the significant effects, the adverse effects of human activities. It focused on particular activities and places and projects and so forth. It had, as Colin points out, very significant accomplishments in a variety of parameters, to which, due credit, but is also almost always hesitant and slow. And the resistance was typically, we don't want to offend our political allies, we don't want to disadvantage elite interests, we don't want to add to public costs. And underneath most of this was, we hope that by delay, we will allow for technologies to emerge that will solve this problem in a way that is both easy and cheap. So that passed. The present is Montreal now has primary sewage treatment. They finally got it done in 1998 or something like that, like 2 decades after the Olympics. They don't have secondary or tertiary. So we have a bunch of these traditional old school pollution problems still to deal with. We've got a bunch of new ones like global climate change, which are addressed exactly the same way. The same issues, the same hopes and fears.
As the Queen's brown trout.
Well, there are scatological metaphors that we could add. But we have a new context that my learned colleague, the honorable member, passed it. The new context is that we are sliding ever more deeply into unsustainability. So the basic numbers there are 150 and 925 million and 67 versus 0.2. So 150 is the percentage of the global carrying capacity for human beings at the current level of technology and managerial capacity that we are now demanding. So that number, which is calculated by the World Wildlife Fund, is highly questionable.
And what is that number again? 100?
150%. We're using 50% more than is sustainable.
Right.
And that number was 130% 4 years ago, and it's just rising. The key thing is the number is rising. So we're using more and more, and it's increasingly unsustainable. At the same time, 925 million people are malnourished, according to the FAO.
Yeah.
1 billion or more people don't have enough. We're using too much, 1 billion people don't have enough. And the last number is 10% of the human population, the richest 10% of the human population gets 67% of the income. The poorest 10%, the people who really need it, get 0.2. And so the benefits of all this growth and more demand on the environment are not going where people need it. That's the essential global situation to which we contribute and from which we catch the legacy. So the essential message there is you're not going to get where you need to go through mitigation of the significant adverse effects. That's preventing your boat from sinking as quickly as it otherwise would sink. What you have to do is reverse the invidious trends so that there is some prospect of floating on for some more years. And that's not mitigating the significant negative effects. That is demanding positive overall effects on the three parameters of usual sustainability: ecological, social, economic, at the same time. It also means, more broadly, that the old assumptions don't hold, the old basic assumptions that underlie sort of the basic system, that we can have continued growth in the current way, and that will give us the wherewithal economically and technically to fix what we mess up. It's not on. That we can have continued growth, and that will deal with pollution or with poverty by the trickling down effect of wealth. Those are key assumptions of how we're operating in the world. They're both not working. In fact, you could describe them as ideas of the old school which no longer has any actual fish. I'm done.
I was waiting for the future solution there, Bob.
Well, I can do that if you want, but that'd probably make it a minute, and I don't know how.
You got another minute to
Another minute?
solve the future, yes.
Okay, well, the minute version is that every one of our undertakings, every project, policy, program, plan, regulatory initiative, fiscal arrangement, whatever, decision at the grocery store, should be making a positive contribution to sustainability in a way that recognizes the interrelationship among all these factors. So it should make multiple, mutually reinforcing, fairly distributed, lasting benefits. That's what should be delivered, and avoid significant adverse effects too. We still do the mitigation part. And it's not what we do typically, but it's far from impossible. We've had under the
Far from impossible.
Far from impossible. We've had formal joint panel reviews under the Federal Environmental Assessment Act over the last 15 years, 5 of them, which have taken that as the test. You've got a project, the test is you have to leave a positive legacy socially, ecologically, economically. That's what's left behind. And they've applied this in several cases to mines. How are you going to have a sustainable effect, legacy from a mine? Well, it's using that as a bridge to the future. You use the revenues and opportunities of the mine, and you say, you've got to do that in a way that's going to leave these communities and ecologies in a better condition than they are now. And if you do that, you can actually deliver sustainable benefits from a non-renewable resource project. Well, if you can do it with a mine, surely you can do it in a whole pile of other things. It's a question of developing the habit of setting that test and applying it. You can all do that. Piece of cake.
One of the important things to understand where we're going, and that's why I love the title of your talk tonight, is Deep Roots, New Shoots, is really understanding the history, because a lot of us forget the accomplishments of the past. You know, if you think about the Toronto Climate Conference of 1988, the opening statement said that climate change, we're committing an experiment on the planet, an experiment that is second only to nuclear war. And there were heads of state at that meeting. Do you think in Durban they're going to say something like that? No, they're not. In the early 70s, we had the Stockholm Conference. And it sort of was the precursor and set the stage for a lot of the international, intergovernmental discussions around sustainability and sustainable development. And I read a paper by Stephen Wood, who is a professor at York University, and he said around that time emerged two realities. One reality became the reality or the discussion around sustainable development, sustainability. The other reality that began to emerge was this sense of urgency. And unfortunately, because people are social animals, and because, as Colin said, they like to kind of put off what's happening now, and as the film said, we have all this data that's telling us, but we don't want to listen, we'd rather just muck around and process. Thank you very much. And to be honest with you, this embracing true sustainability in our everyday lives is a way to begin that virtuous cycle that Bob is talking about. The reality of making that happen is talking about reframing and rejigging and education and outreach and stuff that's going to take a really, really long time. So we have these two realities in the broader environmental domain, and urgency is beating us. The clock is ticking faster than we can put the processes in place to have the conversation about doing something to begin the virtuous sustainability cycle.
I want to bring Colin in on this. Why is it the environmental movement that seems to be the one that's supposed to save the planet? Or is that just our feeling we're that important, or is it really the environmental movement that has that responsibility?
No, I don't think they have the responsibility any more than anyone else or any other sector has responsibility. I mean, I suppose in a democratic society, governments ought to have responsibility for providing the leadership. Unfortunately, they seem to have given up leadership for the most part and have fallen back to a followership kind of role, where it's only if the public is lobbying them hard for something that they actually decide to do it. I think environmental groups are a reflection of civil society. There are lots of different kinds. I mean, some are community activists coming together and deciding they want to get involved in some key issues. Some are groups of scientists. Some are academics who come together and decide that they're going to play a key role in providing leadership. If you look at other countries, and I particularly point to Southern Europe, South America, and the US to some extent, universities play a significant role in public policy development. I don't see a whole lot of that going on in Canada. I'm not sure why, but I'd sure like to.
Maybe
You know,
Bob can
when things go wrong, if academics started coming out and saying, here's what's going on, it's wrong, here's some ideas for solving it, I think it'd be very positive. So no one group has sole responsibility, it's shared.
Let's come back to that, but I'd like
Yep.
to hear what Bob Gibson has to say about why universities aren't a bigger part. Or are they and we just don't realize it, or are universities stepping up to the plate? Being that we're in a university town here.
Not adequately. I think the world has improved a little bit in that category, but universities...
The world or Canada?
The world of universities. And the world of universities in Canada
was smooth.
is probably, well, yeah, right. The problem with universities is like the problem of government departments and the problem of the categorization of expertise into narrow areas where you do some excellent work on your specific stuff, and that's what you're encouraged to do, and that's what you get rewarded for. And if you want to do something that is cross-disciplinary and policy-focused and so forth, you have to have undue confidence, basically. But you can get away with that now in ways that were much harder 20 years ago. There's actual funding for such work now, and there's some credit given, and besides, it's clear that we all have more fun doing this stuff, and so there's a bit of, some examples out there. But the pressures are still fairly invidious in that way. So I think there's an enormous potential for way more work. I think you're exactly right. And there's a desperate need, especially now that it's clear that the capacity is going to be eliminated from most governments. And, they got rid of forestry scientists when I worked for Environment Canada back decades ago. So it's been a continuing process. I don't think governments are going to have that expertise. And so it has to come from someplace. And you really do need expertise. The environmental organizations and the universities could make better common cause, I'm sure, as well as common cause with other interests that have arisen. And the final thing I'd say is that Karen is exactly right on the educational question. The educational question is not universities in particular, it's probably more experience in doing a good fight.
Yeah.
But there is a joint role there. And if it is the case that governments and corporations and civil society, it can't possibly be enough, the only fourth leg is everybody else.
Yeah.
Right? That's all you're left with.
Yeah.
So you really do need to engage people as much as possible to let them learn, you know, in the usual hard and sort of difficult way that happens, and make social engagement fun as part of the exercise and all that stuff, and credit people with what they know. I could go on and on, but I think that that's essentially part of, a core part of the agenda, recognizing still that public government is what we have with legitimacy to carry forth collective action with the power of law and regulatory and fiscal. So it's not a question of just people doing their thing. It's not the one-ton challenge with the delightful Rick Mercer. You know, you can't do it all yourself and government get off the hook. You have to have governments you choose well, you push well, and you expect them to deliver in the public interest. I don't think there's any way around that.
And as hard as I struggled with my colleagues on the Hill for better legislation, better regulations, you can't do it only that way, because you can't regulate everything and you can't regulate everybody.
Right.
But I just wanted to add to the comments on the role of universities. David DeWitt is sitting up there, and David is a former Associate Vice President, Research Innovation at York University, and the new VP Programming here at CG. And I've had the pleasure of working with David for the past number of years at York, where we are experimenting with new institutional forms. I didn't throw this in here because it was just a thought that came to me. It's based on real experience, because I firmly believe that you have to create a new framework for relating to each other. And one way of doing that is we were fortunate enough to have leadership at the top of our institution that said climate change is an important issue, that there is a role for universities, that there is a role for universities to help create sound evidence-based policy making. So how do we do that? And it was a grassroots, bottom-up effort. We worked together, and we developed a new partnership, a new organizational form, which borrows from a lot of other examples, but we bring disciplines together, we bring policy people, we bring industry together, and environmental NGOs. And that's the way you move forward.
But it's a very different model than
other academic here.
It's a very different model than we had. And Bob, you can jump in after. I mean, in the 1970s, what did you have? You could name the environmental organizations off the fingers on one hand. You had a few university programs across the country. And now we've got this plethora of organizations out there and people, and yet we seem to be treading water a little bit more.
I think the universities have done quite well, if too slowly, to move on the question of interdisciplinarity.
Yeah.
I mean, that has come along. I mean, York was the first to do environmental studies on a large scale, cross disciplines. We were in Trent in '74. So that's pretty early on, and it's now pretty much everywhere. But I don't, one of the things we haven't done as well, although we're getting there a little bit, is more links to the general public. Mm-hmm. The university community alternatives is an example. It's trying to get university-based knowledge in plain English, to a wider public. And this forum is a great example of how, community people come in and get some contact, although I suspect a lot are, linked to the university in some way. But nonetheless, I sort of sat back at the last Ontario election and with some horror, looking at the reason the election kind of went the way it went was that there was so much opposition to wind power. And no one was raising, if you don't do wind power, it may have problems, but the other possibility is coal.
Or nuclear.
It's not even close, right, in terms of environmental impact. I mean, the wind might make a little noise. If you strain your ear, you might hear it. My partner's brother lives on an island in Denmark where all the energy comes from wind, and they export it, and he says he's never heard a windmill. They're everywhere. He's getting old. But they've had the windmills for a long time. You didn't hear them then either.
I was intrigued by the sort of final comments in the film when I mean, people were expressing their concern about how humanity has imposed its will on nature and, you know, through technology and overconsumption and things like this, we've created all these terrible problems. But then everybody got all really excited about the possibility of cloning the human brain via
Back to technology.
via technology. And it seemed to me that, you know, we're still playing with the techno fix, you know, I mean, I think that was your comment. If we wait just a little bit longer, we don't have to deal with the tough issues because technology will solve it for us and the Queen will go away. And so it seemed like this whole idea of techno fix was still being applied at the end of the film. And it was, you know, as technological change happens faster and creates more problems, we can create more technology that can move even faster to help us deal with these problems. And it's almost as though we have to go on pause and sit back and say, whoa, what are we doing? Is this the way forward? You know, do we need a fundamental qualitative change, and how do you define that? Because more of something isn't a qualitative change. It's just more of something.
I'm inclined to think that the argument that need will lead to innovation, that the market will drive that, is something that desperately needs to be correct. But it doesn't automatically deliver. So clearly it hasn't delivered. We're over the limit and the technology isn't spurring forth to fix it. Because the motivation structure gives you an interest in, I don't know, having biologically or genetically engineered children who are taller and have the right color of eyes if you're rich, but it doesn't
And
fix
live to
problems of poor
150.
people. You know, good.
Yeah.
But it doesn't aim, it aims where there's money to pay. It doesn't aim where there's public interest to solve. That's the fundamental thing that governments have to redirect. You desperately need the technological gains. We need to do all sorts of things way better and smarter, more efficient, and, you know, more resilient, and all the rest. But it doesn't automatically get directed in the public interest. That's the part that's the challenge. And that's the part that governments will simply not do by themselves for their own motivational problems, but can be pushed by an informed and engaged public, and can be informed better by universities and by citizens organizations and NGOs and so forth. I mean, I don't think we can put a pause on the technology button. I think we want to put a race on the technology button.
No, not
in some areas.
Not a pause on a pause on us.
Yeah.
Let's stop and reflect and think about who we are and what we really want to do.
Yeah, I would agree with that, except that it has to be positive. It has to look doable. It has to look positive. The hair shirt option, as Bob pointed out, it's not going to work. I worked for the Science Council of Canada when we did the Conservative Society stuff. Oh boy, that was a don't. I mean, give those guys some PR help. You don't call it the Conservative Society. It makes everybody, oh, we're going to have to do less, and you know. It's got to be way more fun. It has to be way more exciting. It has to have good stuff that's going to come of it. And right now, I suspect a lot of the reaction of going back to 1950s ideas is because it's all so complicated and bloody scary. There's all sorts of stuff that you'd like to deny and hope that, you know, we go back to the past, maybe all this stuff will go away. It's about as likely as aliens coming and rescuing us. But it's a perfectly understandable reaction. So if there's to be something positive, there's more likelihood that a lot of people will buy into it. And it's not just stopping this and stopping that. It's let's go for this path, because as Bob says, there's way more jobs, way more creativity, way more resilience. The soft energy path is attractive on multiple grounds. Well, people don't recognize that much, but that's the selling point, not that we're going to conserve. But
let's move to the future, because here we are with a government that's not doing So what are we going to do? Sit there and do nothing for the next 2 terms, or?
2 terms.
2 terms. We're really sitting back and doing nothing.
I hope that would get a rise. Excuse our politicians in the audience. But come on, Colin,
No,
what are we going to do?
I think that Bob and Karen are absolutely right in terms of the approach. I don't think it's as difficult as we're suggesting. Again, if we have some leadership. I mean, in
But we
sort of
don't
30,
at the moment.
30
We don't.
well, but we could. I mean, at the 30,000 foot level, I would say the economy has got to be completely restructured. Bringing it more down to earth. We're at a point now where the industrial manufacturing economy in Canada is not doing terribly well, and government is sort of trying to rebuild it, but not really rebuilding it in anything approaching a green way. Let's look at the sustainability of various options. I mean, one of the most sustainable things in an economy is the arts. Theater, music, education, all those good things. I mean, you can have a heck of a good life with all of those non-material things. And with some leaders coming forward, and I don't believe they're going to come from government at the moment, but coming forward in society, saying, hey, let's start creating jobs in those sectors, in what used to be called the soft path sectors, but now look to me to be the green industry sectors, the things that produce fun and enjoyment and a good life with very, very little environmental impact. I think we could really shift thinking from manufacturing being the primary economy to the soft industries being
And
the
is that
primary
the business
economy.
case for the environment, as they asked on
Well, I
the
think
council?
it's very much a part of it. I think, okay, the Ontario government has done green energy, but what about all the other green things? I mean, most of those blue box materials that are being collected from our homes are being shipped overseas for processing. Water bottles and soft drink bottles go to China to be made into textiles, to be made into clothing or shopping bags, to be brought back to Canada for us. There's a huge opportunity there to develop an industry of recycling of materials so that we can cut down on the amount of virgin raw material we have to use and instead keep what's in in society going around and around and around. Same for biomaterials. We got gaga about ethanol for cars.
Yeah.
Well, ethanol's got a whole huge bunch of problems that nobody bothered to look at before they started dumping huge amounts of our money into that. But other things made from biomaterials, bioplastics and better, have much longer life, much greater durability in society, and again, could be a core element of a new green economy for the province or for Canada. Now, in a globalized economy, we do have to take account of what's happening in other countries. It's very difficult for one country to go it alone and to say, we're going to go down the green path where everybody else is doing it the same old way. That's why, and here's sort of where I get into trouble, I'm actually encouraged by the fact that Canada is talking to Europe about a free trade agreement between Canada and the European Union, because Europe's doing a whole lot better than we are in a green economy, and hopefully if we do go into some kind of trade agreement with them, they'll kick our butt to say, hey, you guys have got to start doing as well as we're doing in these areas. And yet the environmental community as a whole seems to be against free trade and doesn't want any part of an agreement with Europe, and is sort of saying we've got to go back to our own inward-looking economy. I could pick up a whole bunch of those kinds of examples where the leadership doesn't have to come from government, although it'd be great if it did, but leadership's got to come from key players in society. The late Ray Anderson is very well known for being a leader in green industry because he had the brainwave of recycling old carpet into new carpet and repairing carpet by pulling up tiles. I mean, pretty trivial kind of stuff. Ray did the best that he could by himself to kickstart that thinking in all the rest of industry. If there had been a few others who had come along with him and said, hey, we're a team, we're going to do this together, maybe you'd have had greater success. So I think people really have to come out of their shell. You know, Canada's great at wanting to be number two. When I go in to talk to a corporate executive with an idea for a green program, it's always, well, who else is doing it?
Yeah.
Forget who else is doing it. We do it first and we do it better.
Yeah, you're here.
We're going to continue in this line, and I'd like to talk a little bit about Canada's international reputation for another couple of minutes. So get ready with your
like a
questions,
stone.
because in about maybe 10 minutes, we'll take a little bit less, maybe about 5 minutes, we'll
Yeah.
take some questions from the audience. And we have some questions here that I can't read
That's,
from our,
and neither can I.
okay, I'm hoping that somebody can, either they can be made bigger or...
Don't read them, they're too hard.
But before that, almost. Thank you.
God bless.
Karen, can you talk a little bit about Canada's reputation on the international stage, how that has progressed, can I say?
Well, I don't want to be partisan,
But
but I will only tell you what my experience was. I was ambassador when we had the Montreal COP, and unfortunately, I don't know if
Montreal was a climate change
the
meeting in Montreal in
I apologize.
2006.
2005.
In December 2005.
And it was the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the meeting of the parties and the committee of the parties, the COP-MOP. So it was both the Framework Convention, Convention of the Parties, it was both the Framework Convention and the Kyoto Protocol. It was very interesting because when you go to the UN, all the flags are set up and the names of the countries are set up. And so one day you were in this larger venue with the people who had signed on and ratified the climate convention. And then the next day, there was a whole bunch of new players because there were a few folks that hadn't signed on to Kyoto. So we actually did some really good stuff. And I worked really closely with the Prime Minister's office at the time and the Minister's office, both Minister, Environment and Foreign Affairs. And I got to know a lot of people internationally. And Klaus Topfer, who was the head of the United Nations Environment Program, was someone that I got to know through that process over a series of meetings and whatnot. And then in January, after the election, I was at a chemicals meeting. And I saw him, and he went, and he was so sad. And I ran into the Danish Minister for the Environment. We'd had meetings with them in Copenhagen leading up to the climate COP. We were strategizing about how we could work together with Canada, make sure we could bring on, we could get a good negotiated outcome for that. Everything was really positive. We were really good friends. She would barely talk to me at this chemicals meeting. I felt that our reputation internationally on environment had dropped like a stone. The reality is that it's not just your reputation on the environment file, but it's your reputation on the other files internationally as well that are impacted. When I was a member of parliament a few years before that, the German government invited some members of the Environment Committee to come to Berlin and basically have the German government officials yell at Canada and tell us that we better get on with the Kyoto Protocol, that Europe saw Canada as the entry point into the United States, and if we weren't even going to bother living up to our commitments and moving forward on the Kyoto Protocol, they weren't even going to bother with us anymore. And I was working with a number of the Nordic ambassadors who basically, very friendly, very politely told me the same thing. So we were encouraged by the international community, and once we started to see some action, there was a lot of positive feedback for that. But very, very quickly, our reputation fell. And when we were in Berlin, they told us, it's not just about Kyoto. If we can't trust you on Kyoto, what are we going to trust you on? How can we trust you on trade deals? How can we trust you on other things? How can you be the honest broker between Europe and US? We're not even going to deal with Ottawa. So it's really important for Canada any national government to think about the implications of their actions on the environment file and how they affect other multilateral processes. And the other thing is, if you're not trusted, and if you don't want to play, you're not going to be invited. So even if you have a contrary interest, you don't even get to sit at the table to influence those decisions. And I think that's what the government of the day has missed the boat on.
Any other comments on this before we go to the audience for questions?
I just support what Karen said. I was at a meeting of UNESCO group on climate change research funding just a couple of months ago. And yeah, people, mostly Europeans, some Africans, they're very well aware that Canada has changed.
Yeah.
I mean, that people would, you know, you're having coffee and that's what you'd get. What happened to Canada?
And yet simultaneously, there are more people. I mean, 5 years ago, probably most people walking down the street wouldn't have known what climate change was 5 years ago. And now, I mean, most people know, are fairly well informed. Canadians are better informed now than they were 5 or 10 years ago, and yet we have...
And a majority of Canadians support strong action.
Yes, yes, they do.
Yeah, it's a funny... At any rate, please take to the microphones if you can, and while people are doing that, I'm going to ask the question that I can now read. And it's a question from George in Cambridge, and welcome to all people that are out there in cyberland watching this tonight. We appreciate having you here. And the question is, new organizations such as NGOs may be part of the solution to some environmental problems, but isn't the real issue that for most people, action on the environment is perceived as optional until a crisis impacts them directly? Who would like to take a shot at that?
Just a quick comment that climate change is the ultimate challenge in this regard because the impacts are, you know, the worst ones are at a distance. We can see some of it now, but you sort of know at 10 or 20 years that the problem is it takes 30 or 40 years to fix it, even if we try our hardest and do our best. So we're lagging behind the point at which we should have acted, and we knew in '88 when Mulroney authorized that conference in Toronto that something should be done, and we talked about doing something, but very few. Europe has moved ahead, but not certainly Canada hasn't. Anyway, that's my comment.
But climate change is happening in Canada now, and people in the Arctic in particular are feeling the effects of that. And I'm involved with the Canadian Pollination Network, CanPollen, and our researchers are seeing the impacts of climate change on bee, and as you know, there's been huge die-off of bee populations. And some of the subtle changes to the climate are having big, huge impacts on populations of certain kinds of species. All you have to do is travel out west and consume a lot of CO2 in the process of doing that, or but you can see the devastation of the pine beetle and what it's done out there. Massive forests are destroyed out there. I mean, Canada is facing the problem of climate change now.
Yeah, we know that, and that information is available, but I'm not sure it's as in the face of the public as it once was in the late 80s, early 90s. I think it was more out there. I don't know if it's NGOs that are doing it or it's the media doing less of a job because, you know, you can find it on the internet. You can learn these things, but you have to take the initiative to find it. It's not pushed.
There's so much information out there.
That's right.
Yeah. Bob.
Go ahead,
Gibson,
Bob.
A couple of points. First, that it is true that a lot of people have lots of things to do, and they get driven into a topic and get involved in it if it seems to press them in some kind of way. And maybe a crisis is a way of describing that often. And often that's kind of a NIMBY reaction, if you wish. But in a lot of cases that we can look at historically, that initial engagement is highly educational, and people move from that to thinking about what are the broader issues that underlie this problem that I have, and do I want anybody else to face it? So you have a gravel pit being dug beside your house. And, well, I don't want that. I'm going to get engaged in fighting it. Those are the people who today are looking at, why do we have to take out so much gravel anyway? And is there some way that we can address the demand side so that we help deal with this problem, but we also reduce the urban sprawl issue, one of the major drivers of gravel demand and so forth. So I think there's an educational part that's very positive even when you come in from that grounds. And secondly, I think we can think of things where people get engaged not because they feel a particular crisis, but because they think it's going to be better in a whole host of ways. And I mean, one of the most interesting phenomena we haven't talked about is slow and ecologically desirable food.
Yes.
Everybody eats, well, at least they should. And hopefully they
much.
drink too. And that idea that you might want to rely more heavily on food where you know where it's produced and you know who produced it and how, and where you have some sense of terroir, as they say in Europe, at least some sense of, this has some character that you can associate with because you live here and so forth. That's enormously attractive, and it's attractive across the most diverse ideological barriers you can imagine.
And it's actually without a perceived crisis.
Maybe somebody thinks their health is in a crisis, or they want to feed their grandson something or other that may have melamine in it. But there are, well, probably you do want to avoid that, but there are positive elements to that. There are attractive elements. I think a lot of people participate in that because they feel a particular crisis because, well, this sounds cool. Why did we do this a long time ago? This is like when I was on holiday in France. Well, it's not quite that good, but it's like that. And I think that there are probably lots of issues that can be approached more in that manner than we have done.
I'm going to turn to the first question of this young woman up here, if I can. Are you the? Oh, okay. I can't see that well. Do we have a question somewhere?
Over there.
Over there. Great.
Hello, my name is Vincent Strickland, and I would define myself as a community activist. Colin mentioned the role of community activists within the environmental movement. So I'd like to know what are the thoughts about the criminalization of community activists most recently that we have been seeing in Canada. For instance, and the attacking of the right to protest and freedom of speech. So most recently, the Keystone protesters in Ottawa were arrested. We also saw last year at the G20 summit on June 2010, there were infiltrations of the police within communities for about 18 months beforehand. And at the summit in and of itself, there was the terrorizing from the police in regards to the protesters where 1,100 people were arrested. I was in Calgary at the time, and I felt that this created an air to the rest of the society that it is unsafe to protest and to engage in your rights. To be an activist. So how do you think that affects the environmental movement? Thank you.
I think it affects it in a very significant way, in a very negative way. I mean, almost all of the issues that I mentioned and many others that I won't take the time to mention now came about because activists held protests, went to the Hill, went to Queen's Park, went to City Hall, did all of those kinds of things. And I think the fact that governments today are putting a chill on all of that is an outrage in a democratic society.
I absolutely agree. I grew up in the 60s, and they say if you remember the 60s, you really weren't there. So I'm not going to comment on whether I remember them or not. But it was an age of protest. And it was an age, in some respects, of great simplicity and naivety, but great passion. And there was a desire to see change. And I cannot tell you how many meetings that I was in where we were going to subvert the dominant paradigm, overthrow the establishment, et cetera, and we had conversation like this forever. But nobody ever said to us, you're unfocused, and what are you really talking about? And you're not going anywhere, and this is just dumb. But you know what? When you hear folks and commentators talk about the Occupy movement, they go, they're unfocused, and they're not really. No, this is a marvelous outpouring of creativity, and it's so thrilling, for example, to see people in the United States occupying Wall Street. You know, it's just such a thrilling thing to see that, because I always thought that that voice in America had been silenced. And I'm so very concerned when I hear the kinds of issues that you've raised. Those things cannot be silenced in this country.
And what's the link between, if any, between this Occupy movement and environmental movement? Bob? Gee.
Well, I think the objectives and the critique of the Occupy movement are dead obvious. And if you can't figure that out, you're paying it. Not you. If you,
Thanks,
not even
Bob.
you. If you can't figure that out.
I think I just got fired. What do you think?
No. That was a different you. It's that ambiguity of the language. If the commentating authorities can't figure out what the message is, they're being willfully blind. It's perfectly obvious it's about inequity.
Absolutely.
It's perfectly obvious that that's a serious problem. And it's perfectly obvious that the people who have the advantages are not particularly keen, with some good exceptions, to do anything about it.
Yeah.
Well, nobody's going to be astonished by any of that. But that clearly is a key component of any sensible environmental agenda.
Yeah.
The Brundtland Commission, 23 different countries during the Cold War agreed that you can't deal with environment issues without dealing with poverty. Now, they're a little wussy on a few points, not surprisingly, but that basic insight is fundamental to what we're trying to deal with now. So,
And are we farther ahead now than in 1984? When
in some ways, yes, in some ways, no. I mean, I wonder about whether there's some kind of pendulum action happening politically, whether there's sort of desperation to go back to 1956. I can remember 1956. It wasn't that great, frankly. Anyway, if we go back to 1956, in your mind, maybe that's going to be satisfying and relieving in some way for a term. But maybe not two.
Yeah.
And I mean, think, for example, Colin is talking about windmills and how the Liberals managed to squeak through in Ontario only because, or despite the fact that they sort of blown it completely in rural Ontario. They would have lost if it weren't for the Ford brothers,
Yes.
right? The Ford brothers saved the Liberal Party by
Absolutely.
being so bad
Absolutely.
that people said, well, we're not going to vote for more people in Queen's Park like those guys. So, I mean, it's possible to push all this beating up of activists and firing scientists and all that. I think it's possible to go too far with that. I think people are not as entirely stupid as is often assumed. So
Somebody called
that's
Mayor,
a kind of indirect way of being positive.
somebody
And-
called
but this-
Mayor Bloomberg a hero of the Occupy Wall Street movement for sending the police.
Well, this leads very nicely into our next question up here, and I need some more questions from the audience, but there's Barry in Victoria is asking, since the 1970s, our federal government has gone from being driven by Canadians' environmental concerns to being controlled by corporate interests. Sort of a sub-theme here. How can we change this situation so that the wishes of Canadians drive regulations based on the best scientific research? Which is kind of an extension of what you've been talking about. Karen, maybe you want to pick up on that?
Well, I think, first of all, you have to take a look at the kinds of tools that we use for public policy making. And ensuring that you have science capacity within the government to do this work and to advise the policy arm of government and the political arm of government is absolutely crucial. And you also not only, like in government, there's the policy stream that goes up, there's the science sort of research stream that goes up, and they get kind of strangled in the middle where the strategic policy branches squeeze all the life out of the evidence that's going on and badly brief the ministers. Because everybody has their own particular agenda to go forward. There's also problems of how one side talks to the other. So if you want to talk about policy decisions based on scientific evidence or sound research or what have you, you have to find ways to talk to each other.
And is government doing that research, or is that mostly corporate,
Well,
university?
There are certain kinds of research that only government can do. And there's only so much research and science work that can be farmed out of government. And what happens is that you get people who are administrators and managers who are trying to understand the science, and that does not work either. You get people who are managing and massaging things, like a Marshall McLuhan massaging the message, and the real truth is not going forward. The problem, if you think that environment is low on the political agenda, the fact that governments invest in science is something your constituents could even care less about, although mine actually, because I educated my constituents, they asked me about Arctic science and Northern science, and they lived in Newmarket, okay? So it's a chicken and egg thing. I'm saying you have to invest in science, but how do you have to have that culture that respects that?
Can I raise one thing there? I noticed the question was from Victoria, which may be the BC version. And I'm thinking back to the 70s, which of course is a little fuzzy. But my recollection of the 70s, and even BC in the 70s, remember Flying Phil Ghilardi?
Yes.
Flying Phil Ghilardi was the Minister of Transport in BC and a social credit government, I think, and he was called Flying Phil because he was the transport minister and he was always caught for speeding or something like that. But his famous statement was, when we were talking about pollution and pulp mills, he said, "I love the smell of pollution. It's the smell of money."
Yes, how many times have I heard
Flying
that?
Phil.
Yeah.
The idea that we once had a democratically sensitive government that just responded to science in an illuminated way and that we've lost this in the recent time, that's completely bogus.
Yeah.
That's not what it was like when I was there, at least when I was paying attention. And while there were some significant accomplishments, while there was some good science done, I remember Harold Harvey trying to tell you about acid rain in the Ontario, not you, kind of work on that, in the Ontario legislature for like a decade or more. Telling about his old crooked up fish from Clarny Park and stuff, and we're getting nowhere.
Yeah.
For the longest time. And the people who were bowed down to were the executives from INCO were saying, "Oh, no problem there. We can't possibly do it anyway if it was a problem." So we haven't really gone into some toilet that we've never been in before. This is a long-term challenge, and part of it is, I think, as Colin has been suggesting, you've got to get the enlightened corporate people on board to see it's in
Yes.
their interest.
Yeah.
To deal with some of this stuff, you have to build those coalitions. You have to have those people push at the same time because they're always going to be powerful in governance. We're not going to get around that. One of the interesting questions that's part of this is how do you fund science in the public interest? Which I think is a longer discussion,
Yes.
maybe deserves a whole
Yes.
CG event on it.
Yes,
Yeah, that's a
absolutely.
very good question. Yeah.
And we don't do that very well, and it's probably at the crisis stage from the previous discussion. They're getting rid of the government scientists. They're not all coming to our department.
No.
Wish they were. We could take a few more. What's happening to those characters? And where is that capacity being replaced? And how can we do that? And all that stuff.
Well, and if you take a look at the funding that's been given to the university, it's being very skewed out towards the corporate side too. It has a very strong business angle.
true.
So that is a problem as well. And I hope that people who are the social scientists, humanities folks in the crowd, we are using science in a extremely broad.
And I'm going to go to the questions because we're running out of time. We have about 5 more minutes. We have 2 questions, so I don't know who was there first, but okay.
Hi, my name is Robert Lepage. I'm with the Building Engineering Group at the University of Waterloo. So in some of the engineering circles, there's a phenomenon known as the efficiency paradox. That is essentially that while the per unit efficiency of a device might actually increase, that the overall net consumption also increases. Some of this has to do with market forces, in that if a new product, if it happens to be like a Boeing 747 that's more streamlined or whatever the case may be, if it uses less resources, then it's now actually more accessible to a larger demographic. So what policies or ideas do you think could help ensure that increased efficiencies don't necessarily result in an increase in overall resource consumption?
Yeah, I mean, another variation on that is you buy a very fuel-efficient car, you just drive more. Or you have very fuel-efficient light bulbs so you don't get off your butt and turn them off.
Yeah.
I think the only way to fix it is probably tax energy more and tax wages less, for instance.
There's two parts to this rebound effect question. And part of it is the individual activity, which may or may not, it depends on that activity. It's really not that likely that somebody's going to buy energy efficient light bulbs and suddenly become extremely wasteful, because that's not like the same mindset. So you can certainly have innovations where it's not likely, because of the nature of the innovation, lead to the rebound effect. The larger rebound effect is we do all the stuff that gets more efficient and consumption rises. But it doesn't rise because you've got this stuff more efficient. It's because it's rising, right? Anyway. And those two things get confused in that literature, which we need to be clear about. And the response to the larger question, which is we've had all this growth happening, even though stuff is getting more efficient per unit of product, is this test of whether what you're doing is delivering more benefits. We can certainly have continued growth in all manner of things that don't use a whole lot of resources. Right? You can have more dancing.
Yeah, I was going to say, especially some of the things that Colin was talking about. You were actually talking about gravy, weren't you?
Yeah.
The arts. I work from Toronto.
Okay,
But just to sort of pick up very quickly, I think that we know how to deal with the rebound effect. We know how to make our lives more efficient. I mean, for example, occupancy detectors in rooms will turn out the lights when nobody is in the room. Let's make them mandatory under the building code in all new construction. That problem then becomes solved. Let's use IT so that instead of meeting like this, we're meeting on the web out of our homes and reducing travel as a result, yet holding conferences and workshops that are just as interesting, just as useful as they would be if we drove 200 kilometers to get to them. There's all kinds of things we can do, but they generally mean integrating the single technology with a whole bunch of other technologies with a good understanding of social behavior and packaging it all so that we change the way we do things in our society.
for which we need leadership, but
We need leadership.
Question here.
Canada is a constitutional democracy, and the Constitution acts as a barrier against bad democratic decisions and influence of governments. In 1982, Canada embarked on a great constitutional endeavor to enshrine rights through the Constitution, Charter of Rights and Freedoms, enshrining political and legal rights. Is there room in the conversation around environment and environmental rights to have a great constitutional effort put forward across this nation to enshrine environmental rights? Right now, Canada doesn't recognize water as a human right. And I think that's something that needs to be confronted. And I'm wondering what the panel has to say on that issue.
Well, on the issue of water, I know some senior officials who turn themselves into pretzels around that question. On the issue of enshrining environmental rights into the Constitution, that's something that I was quite interested in when I was in Ottawa. And if I remember, Finland either has an amendment to their Constitution, but they do have an attachment to their Constitution around environmental rights. I think South Africa as well.
Venezuela has one too.
And Venezuela. And probably, and I didn't participate in a lot of the discussions in the Council of Europe and that, and I'm thinking of the one in Strasbourg, not in Belgium, but they were also looking at that as a possibility. And I think I think the time has come for something like that. And it's about not just the words, but how you operationalize that and how you link that into the Constitution and how you bring it into other facets of other statutes and things like that as well.
Is that, Bob, what you were saying, sorry, that environmentalism has the potential to become the first original ideological perspective?
Yeah, and this, I mean, this has been raised. The first person I remember talking about was Jamie Benedictson back in the 70s, even. He teaches environmental constitutional law at the University of Ottawa. Anyway, I mean, it's come up several times, and it's gotten a little bit of inertia, but it never seems to get there. I mean, it hasn't thus far, but I mean, I think it's a worthwhile campaign, and even if it didn't get enshrined in the Constitution, the talking about it would
Great conversation.
would be worth doing.
Yeah, I think Colin.
Oh, sorry, Colin, go ahead.
Well, I generally agree, and I think it's well worth looking at. I'd say that at the present time, we probably want to be a little bit cautious, because if we go down the environmental rights road, I think there's a strong likelihood we would also get property rights. And enshrined property rights is probably one of the most anti-environment initiatives that one could imagine. So one has to look at the political context of the day, what's feasible, what are the consequences, and then make a decision as to whether it's the right way to go.
And then opening up the Constitution in Canada is our favorite pastime,
Bob,
or not.
Final word to Bob.
I was going to say what Colin scooped me on in his usual brilliant way, but there is a host of other mechanisms short of constitutional change, like Environmental Bill of Rights, which have served reasonably well and maybe do most of what you could hope is going to practically happen from a constitutional change. Our Constitution is, like most Western constitutions, largely about individual rights and not about collective ones. It has a little bit of language rights, it has a little bit of Aboriginal rights, which are collective-ish, but mostly it's about individual rights. And you open it up, your property rights were much more likely to be found compatible with the general idea than collective rights. Although the whole idea is a terrific one. Whether that's strategically wise and strategically a priority to work on, I would remain to be persuaded.
Well, I'm going to invite Fred to come back up. And as he makes his way, I just want to make a comment about as we wind up for the panel. I don't know if you'll agree, but I think the thing that I can't come away with is this need for some leadership, and that in the short term at least, hopefully, well, I won't go there, but we really have to look within for that leadership and find that within, and not wait for somebody else to take control of that, because it's not going to happen. You know, we've tried to pass it along and it hasn't happened. Do you concur with that? And then Fred, take over. Yeah.
And when I was watching the film, they were talking about the fact that we don't want to sacrifice, we don't want to sacrifice our lifestyle, but we're not afraid of sacrificing non-human nature.
And I guess before Fred comes here, we have a couple of minutes. Does anybody want to, your 30-second takeaway, the same as me? Colin, final word?
I'm convinced, and I guess I'm reacting partly to Karen's last comment, but also to everything else that's been said tonight. I'm convinced that we can change society.
We can.
That society can change itself. I mean, I'd use the blue box as a trivial example, but 30 years ago, 40 years ago, there was no such thing, and we weren't doing any recycling. Today, 60 to 70% of street-level homes across the country are using blue boxes or blue bags and achieving something as a result. We need more blue box-like programs. We need the leadership to identify the opportunities to make the change that will move us in the right direction. And I'm convinced that we can accelerate that rate of change and maybe, just maybe, beat the catastrophe that is otherwise coming.
Bob P.
Yeah, I'm also, it's interesting. My course was once called Gloom and Doom 310. As I've gotten older, I've become more, looking back on 40 years, I see that we've made some dramatic changes. The other one is smoking. Who would have believed that 99% of smokers would utterly change their behavior and not smoke in the presence of anyone else? But that is indeed what we've gone and done over a 20-year period. Even in France, I can report it happened.
You have to be at the UN at a conference, a leaders' conference on the rights of the child, and watch them all smoking as 10-year-olds are walking by. Anyway, that wasn't that long ago. I think there's a lesson that we might look at from our neighbors to the south, and if we do some reverse engineering. So in other words, 20 years ago in the United States, there's been such a reversal of the few at the top, 1%, owning so much capital and asset and wealth, and so many at the bottom barely eking out an existence and losing their homes by hundreds and thousands. And there were public policies that were put in place to make that happen. There was all kinds of things that were done that created that mess. And not that Canada's immune to it, because I think we're on that road. But if we did some reverse engineering to look at how that happened and understand how that can be undone, then we'll have a very different society in another 20 years.
Bob G.
I'll go back to your leadership point. And I think that the hope for saviors is about the same place as the hope for the magic technology and the alien invasion of amiable people, right? It's not going to happen, and at least you wouldn't want to count on it. That doesn't mean you don't want leadership, but I think you want to combine that with what Karen was saying about education, and you want tens of thousands of leaders, and you want them in a whole variety of different fields, and you want them working with a whole variety of different strategies and tactics, because we don't know what the perfect answer is that's going to work. And most importantly, you want them all to be trying to get a whole vast variety of gains from whatever they're trying to do. So they're not just trying to rehabilitate an ecosystem, they're trying to draw the community in to care for it.
Absolutely.
They're not just trying to generate energy efficiency, they're trying to get jobs and some reduction of our emissions and abate climate change problems, and a host of other things that could go along with that. And every one of those things we can think of, the lowest hanging fruit, the stuff that has most been neglected, is your opportunity to get multiple benefits out of the single undertaking. Because we do things in little boxes, little cubicles, little areas of expertise in the university, little specializations in government, little job descriptions in industry, we typically don't go beyond our immediate expertise, our immediate mandate, our immediate motivation. But because we've been so unbelievably stupid, it's not very hard to be completely bloody brilliant, right?
In comparison.
I'm done.
That's it, I'm done. Fred.
And I'm very pleased when our discussions live up to the catchy titles we give them. And tonight we certainly did hear a lot about the deep roots of the environmental movement over the past 40 years from people who played a very active role in those formative years and all through. But we also heard beyond the early triumphs, I was feeling pessimistic at one point tonight, but I started to hear more and more about the new shoots and the possible solutions, the scientific solutions, the coalitions that are possible. And certainly I think there was a consensus that the answers seem to be tied to public awareness, the will of the people, and the strength of democracy. And although there's a whole new can of worries there to be opened up, maybe we do see some new shoots forming in terms of grassroots activism too. So I want to thank you for your ending on optimistic notes. So thank you, Nicola, Colin, Bob, Karen, and Bob. Thank you very much. Just a few brief notes for our audience before we adjourn tonight. The video from tonight's live webcast will be edited and posted to CG's website in our online video archive. I'd like to say thanks again to Alternatives Journal for helping us celebrate their 40th anniversary and helping to organize tonight's event, bringing in such excellent speakers. As well as I'd like to thank CG's event sponsors, 570 News and Wordsworth Books. Our next event will be a special evening presented by CG and the Canadian International Council, or the CIC, the Waterloo chapter. And this signature lecture, entitled Please Make It Stop, Traditional Portraiture in the Age of the Global 24-Hour News Cycle, will take place on Thursday, January 19th, and will feature as our keynote speaker Daisy Rockwell, a fourth-generation New England artist and the granddaughter of the famed artist Norman Rockwell. She'll be on stage in discussion with Christina Fair of Georgetown University. And accompanying this event will be Daisy Rockwell's artwork, which will be on exhibit for 2 weeks beginning January 19th at the Waterloo Community Arts Centre, also known as the Button Factory. So stay tuned to our events calendar at the CG website to learn more about that and other upcoming events. Also, if you'd like a tour of the new CG campus, they're free every second Friday, so not this Friday, but November 25th is the next one. You don't have to register, you just show up here at noon on those second Fridays. Bob Gibson was mentioning, let's reduce the need for gravel. Well, this campus was constructed with a new bubble deck technology that uses 30% less concrete and hence less gravel. So learn more about that by coming on our tours. Don't forget to purchase a copy of Alternatives magazine on the way out. Special anniversary issue on special discount tonight. And thank you once again for coming to CG. Have a safe journey home. Oh.
I just want to thank the audience for coming out this evening, and I particularly want to thank CG for partnering on our 40th birthday for the magazine. It's been a real honor to be, I hoped we were the inaugural performance in this room, but it turns out we're number 4, but 4 rhymes with 40. So thank you very much to CG and Colin for helping us out, and to all the alternative staff that did a ton of work on it as well, and happy birthday, 40 more years.